Hi, this is James, and I'd like to welcome you to part 3 of my video series on how I read a Lenormand 9-card layout. So in the first video in this series, I showed you what I call the searching for the significator method, where we went through the deck, we picked out the significator card, and we looked at the cards that came before it and after it. In the second video in this series, I demonstrated what I call the searching for the topic card method, which is a variation of the first one. Only instead of looking for a significator card, we look for a topic card, and once again, we look at the cards that came before it and after it. In this final installment of this series, I'm going to be showing you my preferred method of working with a 9-card layout, where I shuffle the entire deck, I fan the cards out, and I pick the 9 cards face down that are going to make up the entire reading, and I let the Lenormand dictate what the topic or the focus card is going to be. So now that I've talked about the process, the deck that's going to be assisting me for this video is one of my favorite go-to Lenormand decks, and that is La Faneuse Lilac Dondolf. So I will be leaving information about that deck in the description box below, so you can check out more about it and you can make the decision on whether you'd like to add it to your own personal collection. And now that I've talked about the description box below, if you just happen to be joining me for this installment of the series, I will also be putting the links to the first 2 installments in the description box below as well, if you'd like to see those. So now that I've talked about the process and the deck, let's get to the table and take a closer look at the 9 cards that are going to be making up this particular Lenormand layout. And here we are with the cards on the table, so I'm going to take a moment and shuffle the cards. And as I shuffle the cards, I'm going to come up with a scenario to work with for this 9-card reading. So let's say I've done one on relationships and I've done one on work. So I'm thinking for this one, I'll blend both. So let's say we have a couple, John and Nina. So let's say that they are faced with the idea of having to relocate due to work. So let's make this scenario real interesting. Let's say Nina is the one who has to relocate for work. So Nina works for a large company, corporation. Let's say they're nationwide. And so she has now gotten a promotion and she's being moved to work in their corporate offices in another state. And so now John and Nina want to both know how that's going to go, especially in the light of the fact that John also has his own career, and how is that going to impact both the relationship and each of their careers. So that's a scenario. And now I'm going to go ahead and once again going to cut the cards away from me, because this is not a situation about me. And now I'm going to put them back together. And now I'm going to take a moment and do what I love to do most with decks, and that's fan the cards out. If you are no stranger to my videos, you know I love fanning the cards out, so I'm going to fan them out. And when I'm allowing the Lenormand to pick the focus card, what I do is I tend to just go through the fan and pick out 9 cards. I'll put them here. 9 cards that are speaking to me. So this is 2. Oh, we have 2 here, so 3 and 4. So those would be the first 4 cards. Now this next card here, I'm picking this one, it's going to be the focus card. And now we're going to pick 4 remainder cards. 2, 3, and 4. So these cards here at the bottom are going to be our 9 cards. So I'm going to take the remainder of the deck aside, put it aside. So like I said, we have these first 4 cards. The middle card then the remainder cards. So this is card 9, so 9, 8, 7, 6, 5 goes on top, then 4, 3, 2, and the first card. So these are 9 cards. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a moment to readjust the camera and lay the cards out, and we will proceed. And here we are with the 9 cards making up the 9 card reading. And when I work with the cards in this fashion, I tend to go with the middle card first, the focus card, and seeing what that card is, and then I work my way out. So the middle card here is, ooh, we have here the gentleman. Okay, so now the gentleman is a significator card, and keeping in context with the scenario that I was talking about when I shuffled the cards, this would represent John. If you remember, John and Nina are a couple, and Nina has been presented with the opportunity to accept a promotion in the company corporation that she works for. But with that promotion, it requires a move to corporate offices in another state, right? And so with that, part of the scenario is, well, if Nina does go with the move and relocation, she accepts a promotion, where does that leave John? And so the Lenormand has determined, like, the focus of this reading is going to be from John's side of things more so than Nina's, unless the lady card shows up. But right now, the Lenormand has put the focus on John, right? And the other thing with that, because I read with direction in mind, then because John is facing the right column here, then the column behind him represents the past, this column here will represent the present, and then the right column will represent the future. So John has given us direction to keep in mind when we're looking at the columns, right? So after we determine what the focus card here is, then what I do is I look to the first card. For me, the first card is the opening card. It says, this is what's prompting the need for the reading being done. So here we have, ooh, okay, so here we have Crossroads. So Crossroads is a card that for me can represent choices, it can represent options, it can represent alternatives. This is a wonderful card to see as the first card because it fits the context of the scenario again. Now remember, John and Nina are now faced with choices and options about moving forward. This card here in the first position prompts a natural question, which way do we go? Right? So that would be like, what is prompting the reading? Basically that question, which way do we go from here? And then Crossroads for me is all about choosing the best course, right? So it's about, like, this reading is being done. We're going to be looking at choices. We're going to be looking at options. We're going to be looking at alternatives. And then based on what's being presented, we're going to choose what we determine to be the best course of action to move forward. So that would be the opening card. And then now we look at the closing card to see if we see how things open up, we can potentially see how things are going to end. So taking a look at this card, we have the Scythe, okay? So the Scythe can be a little bit of a challenging card. For me, it can represent things like a break, it could represent a split, it could represent something being severed. And with that, if we go with the idea that John has to now take a look at what he's going to do in terms of his own work, his own career, well, this could be hinting at the idea about severance, right? Now, one of the choices and decisions that could be made pertaining to John and Nina is that the couple could split. So, and that what that could mean is potentially Nina could go on to relocate in this other state, and then John stays where he's at. That's an option. Because if we read the pair here, now we have, a sudden decision, because I tend to look at Scythe as something that's fast, something that's sudden, something that's unexpected. So we have a sudden decision. We have the decision to split, which I already talked about. And then we may have unexpected decisions, right? It could also be, too, we don't know the time frame that the powers that be at Nina's company or corporation have given her. So it could be like they may have to make some quick or fast decisions in terms of what they're going to do to move forward, right? Basically, Crossroads and Scythe could suggest, like, decisions are going to need to be made, and they're going to need to be made quickly. So now that I've taken a look at these three cards, then what I do is I turn over all the other cards so we can see all the other cards in the reading. So second card is book. Third card is stork, and so look at this. So now we have another card that fits the context of the situation perfectly. Stork can represent a move or a relocation. So that's interesting to see. Okay, so then the next card, the card behind gentleman, is stars. And in front of gentleman we have coffin. Okay. And then looking at the final two cards, we have clouds. Okay. And birds. Okay, so now what I like about birds again is a card for me that can fit the context of the situation, because birds for me, especially when there's two birds on the card, can represent a partnership. So here we are talking about John and Nina, so birds could fit them in that context. Okay, so now what we'll do is, now that we have all the cards revealed, we'll start taking a look at the reading by starting with the columns. Alright, so now taking a closer look at the column on the far left, which would represent the past. If we consider John as direction, he is in front of this column, so that would be the past. So here we have crossroads. So crossroads, as I mentioned in the previous segment, for me can represent choices, options, alternatives, decisions that need to be made. Stars, the next card down, is a card for me that can represent aspirations and inspiration. So if we go with the aspiration aspect of stars, this could be like each person in the relationship, both John and Nina, have their own, career aspirations. Apparently, obviously, since Nina was given the promotion at her company or corporation, that was one of the things that maybe she had aspired towards, was moving up. And so stars in this context could be the idea here about someone's wish being fulfilled, because I tend to look at stars as about wishes. If you go with the idea about when you wish upon a star, so that's how I look at that. So also too, the interesting thing about stars can be a card that can represent clarity. And so it fits with the context of the situation, is because they are seeking clarity about direction. And that's another thing for me about stars, is direction. And I get that if you go with the idea that stars can represent navigation, and I tend to think of like GPS, so that's where I get the idea about direction. So here they are, they're seeking clarity about direction, which may help them make better choices and decisions. So that's how I would look at the two cards together as a possibility. If they have clarity, then their options become clear. If they have a sense of direction, if they feel like they're giving clear guidance, then their options will become clear. So that's how I would read the first two cards. And so now, interestingly enough, we have clouds at the bottom, which is the most challenging card in the deck. And clouds typically, for me, represents uncertainty and confusion and having doubt. So I would tend to look at, if we pair stars and clouds, I would look at this as hopes and wishes lead to uncertainty, right? So someone's got their hope or their wish going with stars, and now things as a result of that have led to uncertainty, right? And then if we mirror crossroads and clouds, here we have uncertain choices or uncertain decisions, that kind of energy. So that's how I would read this. If I was to sum up the line, I might think of something like, each person in a relationship has their own aspirations and goals, and as a result of that, choices have become confusing or uncertain. Right? It could even be, if we keep John as the focus, it could be, well, John may be very happy for Nina because her wish has come true, but as a result of that, it makes his position a little unclear. So that's how I would look at the first column. And so now we'll take a look at the next column. And now taking a look at the middle column, which represents a present, we have book, we have gentleman, and we have birds. So since we have a significator card in the middle, I tend to look at the outer cards in a couple of ways. I tend to look at the card that's above the significator card as possibly what's on the person's mind, and I tend to look at the card below the significator as something that is either unconscious or something that the person has worked on overcoming because he's standing on it, right? So those are a couple of ways that I will look at that. So now if we go with book, book can be a card that can represent knowledge, can represent learning. So there's some aspect of that. So it could describe John as a knowledgeable man, you know, an educated man. You know, it could also describe him as, you know, possibly, if we go with the literal aspect of book, this could be somebody who is a novelist, somebody who's an author. You know, he could be somebody who's writing a book, that kind of thing. Now, because book is above him, it's on his mind, book can also represent, especially when the book is closed like it is depicted in this image, is that there could be, you know, some sort of secret. So John could have some sort of knowledge in his head or on his mind that he's not sharing. And then that would make sense with the card at the bottom. If we have birds at the bottom, birds is a card that can represent communication, right? In addition to, like I said before, about a partnership. So this could be like, you know, a talkative man, a communicative man, you know, a man who's very verbal, you know, somebody who's a speaker. So he could be, you know, his profession could be, he could be an author and a speaker. Right? And so that may be, those may be his professions, right? He may be, you know, going around talking about the book he's written. So there's that. But the interesting thing I find with the book and gentleman combination, from Lenormand's perspective, the Lenormand could be saying to, like, this is a reading about John. Because I tend to read book as, you know, a reading in and of itself. Just like a book can be read, cards are read, right? So it could be a reading about John. Right? And so with birds, again, you know, and if we consider, like, this is something he has to work on overcoming, you know, and something about his unconscious, then John may have, if we go with the idea of what I said with the previous column about maybe John being happy for his wife, but now he's in a space where he's uncertain about what that's going to do for his career, right? And where does that leave him? Then he may be harboring some sense of frustration, because from an emotional standpoint, I tend to look at birds as frustration. That's one emotion that I attach to birds. So he may be harboring some frustration, which he's not sharing, which is why book is, in this context, could represent a secret. He's keeping his frustration a secret about the situation, right? It may be, too, another thing he may be keeping secret is that he may have some anxiety about the future of this partnership or relationship with this career change being presented to them. You know, so for him, he may have to overcome frustration. And the best way probably to overcome that would be to actually talk about it, right? With birds being about verbal communication, it could be, instead of keeping it to himself, he may be better off sharing his frustrations and his anxieties about his uncertainties with Nina, right? So there's that. So that's how I would look at this row. So again, it could be talking about John in terms of his profession, because each of these cards could be something that's describing him. Again, somebody who is well-read, somebody who's educated, somebody who's knowledgeable, but also to somebody who's harboring a secret, you know, and also to somebody who may be a speaker. So he may be an author and a speaker, but also to maybe his considering being willing to talk about his frustrations and his anxieties about the situation, right? So that's how I would look at the middle column. And so now let's take a look at the future column. All right, so now for the future column, we have stork, we have coffin, and we have scythe, right? So stork, again, is a wonderful card to see here in this reading because it actually represents a move or relocation, which fits the context of the situation, right? So I'm sticking with move and relocation with this situation. Those are my go-to keywords for this context. We could also put in change and improvement. That's another aspect of stork. So this could be talking about there is going to be maybe some change in the future, but I'm going to stick more with the move and relocation. And so then we have coffin. So coffin can represent an ending or a completion of some kind, right? But I think in this context, some of my other keywords for coffin would be something being finalized or something being terminated, right? So I'm going to consider those as options, going back to crossroads, as options for coffin. And then again we have scythe, and I mentioned scythe as, you know, something that is swift, something that is fast, something that is sudden. You know, could represent something being split, you know, something being severed, those kinds of things. If I was to take the entire row into account, I might think of something like having to do with a move or relocation, going with stork, becomes finalized, if I go with the finalized aspect for me of coffin. So a move becomes finalized, and then going with the fast, sudden, swift, quick nature of scythe, I would say quickly. So the line could be read as a move or relocation becomes finalized quickly. Again, now remember, when we paired crossroads and scythe, it represented the possibility of decisions needing to be made quickly. So that would make sense in that context. So that's how I would read this particular column. And so now what we'll do is we'll take a look at the rows for more information. So for the top row, we have crossroads, we have book, and we have stork. Right, again, in keeping with some of the keywords that I've already mentioned, I'm sticking with the idea of options and alternatives for crossroads, and book being about knowledge, about something being learned, and the possibility of a secret, right? So if we pair crossroads and book, we have options and alternatives are learned about, and it could be, you know, another possibility here would be the choice to keep a secret, going with what I talked about with the middle column and John possibly keeping some information to himself. So again, those would be the options and alternatives are learned about, and the choice to keep a secret. And then if we pair book and stork, now remember stork being about the move and relocation, then it could be knowledge about a move or relocation. Right? And then if we pair crossroads and stork as the mirror cards, if we pair them, then we have the decision to move and relocate. So it looks pretty clear with stork in the future position here that the move probably will happen. It's just a matter of making the decision. So with book in the middle, it could be like, what additional information or knowledge do they need to have to make that decision, right? And then book would suggest like going about getting that information. So that's how I would look at the top row. Now for the middle row, we have stars, we have gentlemen, and we have coffin, right? So again, I would probably pick aspirations for stars, and then if we pair that with gentlemen, then we could be taking a look at John's aspirations, you know, and with direction in mind, if this is behind him, if stars is behind him, then it could be aspirations he may have had in the past, you know, and then with him looking at coffin, if coffin represents an ending, possibly, then it could be John facing some kind of ending or facing some kind of completion of something, You know, if we take the whole row into account, we could have aspirations, going with stars, for the man, gentleman, come to an end. Right? And that would make sense given the fact that stars is behind him. So, and it could be, if that's the case, then another thing that's coming to me in the moment with coffin is that sometimes for me this card can be about closure. So it could be, if that's the case, if John has to kind of let go of some of his own aspirations or goals in order to support Nina in the move, then he would have to seek some kind of closure. And that would make sense too if he's harboring any kind of frustration, if he's keeping any anxiety to himself about the future, you know, any kind of doubts or uncertainties. If he's keeping that all to himself, let's say, then he's got to find a way to seek closure around that. The other possibility here with coffin is that coffin doesn't necessarily have to represent something coming to a complete and utter end. You know, it could also mean too, like, you know, things become limited or restricted. If you go with the idea that the coffin is symbolically a box, you know, and it's a box that has a limited amount of space in it, then it could just represent like John in the future is going to have to deal with some sort of limitations or restrictions, right? So it may even be like his aspirations aren't totally lost, you know, or totally coming to an end. It just may mean like some of his options are going to become limited and restricted, and he's going to have to actually face that. He's going to have to deal with that. So that's how I would look at that particular row. And then if we look at the bottom row, we have clouds, we have birds, and we have scythe, right? So again, clouds for me represents uncertainty, right? And birds is about the partnership. So here we have a pairing that could suggest uncertainty about the partnership, and that would make sense going forward. If the idea here, a possibility is of a split, you know, the option or a choice to split, like Nina would go to the corporate offices in the other state and John would stay here. So there is that option. So there is that, you know, uncertainty about the partnership, especially if there's going to be a split in mind. So it could be uncertainty about the partnership is discussed, keeping with the conversation, communication, discussion aspect of birds. It could also be John's uncertainty leads to frustration, given with the idea that these cards are below him. So these are something that he's having to work on overcoming. So he's having to work on overcoming, uncertainty and doubt and his frustration. And then if we pair birds and scythe, we can have communication if he takes the choice, the option to communicate. And the interesting thing here is, as I'm saying that, birds knights to crossroads. So there is that option. There is an option to talk. There is an option to have a conversation. So if John was to actually take that option and have a conversation, they could actually discuss the idea of split or you know, a separation of some kind. They could actually talk about that. That could be one of the things that they talk about. But the challenge here sometimes with scythe for me can represent something that's broken. So we could have communication becomes broken, or communication leads to a disconnection. You know, so there is that possibility as well. And the other thing about scythe is a card that can represent pain, right? So it could be having a painful conversation. You know, something is said and one of the parties is hurt. You know, so this could be a painful conversation. So it could be, you know, uncertainty about having a conversation because it may result in someone feeling hurt. So there is that, like, you know, people saying something, but they're saying like, I didn't want to share that with you because I didn't want to hurt you, kind of thing. So there's that. And then if we pair the mirroring cards, clouds and scythe, we could have sudden uncertainty, if we go with sudden for scythe and uncertainty for clouds, or sudden confusion. Could also be too, if we go with the more positive aspect, there's a positive slant to this. It could be confusion that's cut short. And it could be like the confusion gets cut short as a result of having the conversation, right? So that's how I would look at the bottom row. And so the one last thing I'm looking, and this is just coming to me in the moment, if we go with the idea about birds being about conversation, sometimes in the challenging sense, birds can represent like chatter. It could represent gossip, it could represent rumor, it could represent speculation. And the thing that I'm seeing in the moment is I'm looking at the playing card inserts, and I noticed that there are face cards in all four corners. We have the Queen of Diamonds on Crossroads. We have the King of Clubs on Clouds. We have the Jack of Diamonds on Scythe. And we have the Queen of Hearts with Stork. And so just seeing that kind of energy, here we have like four people who are kind of like on the outside of the situation. So it could be like people who are weighing in about things with John and Nina. You know, they may be talking about them. They could be talking to Nina about John, you know, given with the idea that John is the focus here. There could be a lot of conversation about John. You know, people are talking about him. And so now people could be talking about him to him, or they could be talking about him behind his back, without his knowledge, that kind of thing. But it just struck me as I was talking about birds and conversation, I just noticed that birds could represent gossip and rumor and speculation, but there are four face cards, which means that there is a group of people possibly who are all weighing in on what's going on with the situation. And so now what we'll do is we'll take a look at the diamond to wrap this reading up. And now taking a look at the diamond, we have book, we have stars, we have birds, and we have coffin for the diamond. So now, if you remember in my previous videos, what I do is when I look at the diamond, I look at the pairings. So I'm going to take book and stars starting off. And here we have book can represent a project. Just one of my other keywords for book is project. So here we have a project, and then stars would be something that could be inspiring. So we have the possibility of an inspiring project. But keeping with the context of the situation, this pairing could also suggest knowledge of a wish coming true, and that would make sense because remember now, the reading is being done because Nina got her wish come true, and now it's producing, well, how do we move forward, right? So there's knowledge about a wish coming true, so there's that. Then we move to stars and birds. And so here we have the idea here where I talked about stars can be about direction and guidance. So here we have direction. And then we have discussion. So it could be direction is discussed. And then adding another layer to that could be direction is discussed in a partnership, going with the idea that birds can represent a partnership. Could also be a goal is discussed. Right? So there's that. And as I'm talking about that, I just realized, for me, book and stars can represent divination. So that's very interesting. So it could be like, you know, again, prompting John and Nina to have a greater sense of clarity and guidance would be having the reading done. So that just jumped out at me in the moment. But again, going back to stars and birds, we have here, you know, direction is discussed or a goal is discussed. And then birds and coffin could suggest a partnership becomes limited, right? If we consider the idea that John and Nina could just stay in different locations and try and make that work, but there would be some sort of limitation on that. And it could also be too, the possibility here would be like a partnership comes to an end. There is always that possibility. Right, so again, that could be partnership becomes limited or a partnership comes to an end. It could also be too, if we keep with the idea that birds can represent communication and conversation, with coffin, it could represent a final conversation. So I'm seeing that as possibilities. Then if we go with coffin and book, here we have the end of a project, completion of a project. But here's an interesting thing too. So coffin, for me, can represent storage. If we go with the idea that it symbolically represents a box, then this could represent storage. And then book could represent knowledge. So here again, we have the idea possibly about knowledge being confined or concealed or being kept to oneself. Like I'm just going to store it away kind of thing. So there's that possibility again, like John could choose not to share what's on his mind entirely. So on that note, I will wrap up and end this video installment of my 9-card reading series. And so this actually brings our series to a close. In the very first installment of the series, I showed you how I search for the significator and do a 9-card reading with the 4 cards that come before the significator and after. And then in the previous installment, I showed the same method, only instead of a significator card, I showed how I read it with a topic card in mind. Again, searching through the deck for the topic card, and then looking at the 4 cards that came before it and the 4 cards that came after it. And I just completed, actually this is my favorite out of the 3. I let the Lenormand determine what the focus card is and randomly pick cards that are going to be around it. So that's the 3 ways that I read a 9-card reading. So as I close, I'd like to thank you for sharing space here with me throughout this video series, and I look forward to seeing you again and talking with you again in our next video series together. So until then, I'm hoping that you have a wonderful day and take care.